On September 15th, 2024, a celebration of life was held at the Ethical Society of Philadelphia for the journalist and author Stephan Salisbury. Remembrances came from his family members and colleagues. His widow, the artist Jennifer Baker, organized the event and was the opening speaker.
So, welcome everybody, and thank you for being here to celebrate Stephan's life with us. I think Stephan made a big difference in the world, and certainly with his family, who he adored. I can't see it. Excuse me. Our son Nathaniel, his partner Natty, our daughter Molly, her husband Sam, and our granddaughter Sadie Joy, who has brought so much joy to last year despite Stephan's illness. Since I'm incapable of doing justice to all the things that Stephan did, we've asked a few people to highlight different aspects of Stephan's life and tell us about that. The first speaker is our daughter Molly.
Today there will be a number of people who will speak about what my dad meant to the newspaper industry, the Inquirer, the city of Philadelphia. I'm going to speak about my dad as my dad. He was loving and supportive, silly, and very funny. I miss him very much. When we were very young, he would chase us around and sling us over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes, turn us up and down, and shake the salt and pepper out while we laughed hysterically. When we heard him at the door after work every day, Natty and I would gather some distance away to get a running start and tackle him when it opened. He made up silly songs for our cat, such as Thunderpaws and Cat Food on Parade, which I now sing to my cat. He and Natty had an elaborate, years-long joke about Governor Rockefeller asking for more potatoes in a silly voice, and a chicken joke that I never quite understood about chickens who go bawk, bawk, bawk with a German accent. He read to us for years. We loved the classics, Wizard of Oz and Mary Poppins, and the new classics. I would hear him and Natty reading Captain Underpants aloud all the way downstairs as my dad was laughing so hard he was gasping for air and could barely get through a page. We finally threw in the towel when neither of us could get through the first 30 pages of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which described the rocks. He encouraged me to read widely and to genuinely enjoy books often considered long slogs like Moby Dick or War and Peace, which I still haven't finished, and to pay attention to subtle aspects, guiding me with suggestions like the real story is in the passages about whaling. When I was 4 years old, we moved to Swarthmore, and I rode the train to pre-K in the city with my dad every day. We looked out the window together and listened for the stops. As a trained observer, he taught me to look for clues in the world around me, and we discussed how we knew we were now in Philadelphia. The answer was row houses and garbage. No judgment intended, just observing. I think about this often as I ride the train with my own daughter, and we get a similar joy pointing at things we see from freight trains to scrap yards and weedy lots. When I got older, my dad drove me to school every day, and a ritual that stuck with me for years as one of the most quietly supportive acts of a parent I've experienced. He cut up fruit for me and Natty every day, took peeling bites, and he made us lunch. As a teenager, I struggled to get to school on time, and he would speed mightily on the way in an effort to get me in while I ate my oatmeal in the car. We would have pleasant and funny conversations on the way, and he never chastised me or shamed me for being late. He had an ability to gently hold people to account that I greatly respect. Picture a holiday meal with relatives, different generations, maybe a new significant other, and somebody says something a little off. Many people might brush it off and then fume about it later, but my dad, if the moment was right, would instead look at that person and say, well, I'm going to have to challenge you on that. And would go on to explain in thoughtful detail why they were wrong. But somehow the other person would usually engage in a back and forth, and while they might feel corrected, they never felt insulted. Few people can challenge political differences or call out bias in this way, and not leave the other person feeling offended, hurt, or snubbed. I think this is how one actually can change hearts and minds. In that vein, I'd like to talk a little bit about my dad's ideals. He valued his journalistic integrity and was careful to adhere to the story, declining awards that might have meant a great deal to him because they would have given the appearance of bias. He used journalism to call attention to issues that were deeply important to him, but let the story speak for itself. He taught me that there really is no such thing as objective truth, that how you present information shapes how it is perceived. And he said to me on many occasions that he was not a liberal, but a radical. He got his start in adulthood as an activist while his friends were being shipped to Vietnam. And I believe that his perspective as a radical and an activist was not always visible, but was a driving force toward his identity. He sought to amplify the voices of those who were oppressed and draw attention to injustice and to the erasure and whitewashing of history. He encouraged me in often subtle ways to do the same, to not bend to convention or convenience and to look for substance over rhetoric. As an adult, my dad was incredibly supportive, and he also challenged me, urging me to pursue my dreams, delve deeply into my interests, and find what I was passionate about. Natty and I have very different interests, and we were both encouraged to push to do our best. The goal being that we be fulfilled, engaged, and happy adults. When I entered medicine, my parents were a bit appalled. And they were a bit appalled when I left as well. My dad said to me that he was shocked at first, but that medicine was clearly not been right for me, that it had seemed right for a time but wasn't. I was clearly much happier away from it. I thought I would find something that was right, but there was no rush. I was spending time with my baby, and that was something special and worthwhile. That conversation, loving and honest, and seeing me as a complete person, was a true representation of him as a parent. My parents were married nearly 35 years and knew each other far longer. I saw them encourage each other, work together, and share common interests, values, and passions. Together, they've been welcoming of anyone we might bring home. From a friend in need of a meal, a listening ear, to someone we were dating. They always made the effort to get to know them, strategizing on how to best encourage them, listening to their interests and aspirations with genuine attention, and encouraging them to be their best selves. When Natty started dating Natty, early on, my dad called me up and asked me what I thought, and if I thought he was making her feel welcome and comfortable. When my parents met Sam, we were quite young. They made a genuine effort to get to know him as an individual. They welcomed him into our family with open arms, much as his family has done to me, coming to appreciate his sense of humor and to trust him like another of their children. Seeing my dad meeting and interacting with Sadie has been one of the greatest gifts. I wish so much that he could see her grow up and that she could get to know him and appreciate his sense of humor, get his encouragement at school, have him read to her, to end her essays. This year, they developed an incredibly sweet bond filled with fun and joy, and she absolutely developed an appreciation of jokes. They would point at things together and poke fun at the political spectacle on the TV. They talked on the banana phone frequently, and my father very seriously introduced her to the cats one by one. They read together, and Sadie climbed all over him and always had such a big smile for her grandpa. And I had the joy of getting some thoughtful parenting wisdom, such as when the baby is pulling on your hair and laughing. That could be a good time to try out a no. I'll leave you with the image of how I most often picture my dad. Laying in bed with 3 cats on him, Peaches on his chest, Raoul on his legs, Lulu in the crooker's arm, reading and watching baseball on YouTube.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Sam Black. I'm Stephan's son-in-law and mom's husband. As many of you know, Stephan had a great love of cats and shared a special bond. No matter the cat, if Stephan was there to cat or cats, would inevitably take up residence on his person. The poem I'm reading is, I'm told he was my father using. This is from Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats by T.S. Eliot. It's called The Naming of Cats. The naming of cats is a difficult matter. It isn't just one of your holiday games. You may think at first I'm as mad as that when I tell you a cat must have 3 different names. First of all, there's the name that the family uses daily, such as Peter, Augustus, Alonzo, James, such as Victor or Jonathan, George, or Bill Bailey. All of them sensible, everyday names. There are fancier names if you think they sound sweeter, some for the gentlemen and some for the dames, such as Plato, Admetus, Electra, or Demeter. But all of them sensible, everyday names. But I tell you, a cat needs a name that's particular, a name that's peculiar and more dignified, else how can he keep up his tail perpendicular, or spread out his whiskers, or cherish his pride? Of the names of this kind, I can give you a quorum, such as Monkstrap, Quaxer, or Cocopat, such as Bambalurina or Jelliori. Names that never belong to more than one cat, but above and beyond, there's still one name left over, and that is the name that the cat will never guess. That you will never guess. The name that no human research can discover, but the cat himself knows and will never confess. When you notice the cat in profound meditation, the reason I tell you is always the same. His mind is engaged in a rapt contemplation of the thought of his name is ineffable, deep and inscrutable, singular name. I'm also stepping in here for Peter Rand, Stephan's cousin, who unfortunately wasn't able to be here today due to illness. He had prepared some remarks that I'm going to read on behalf. When he says I, he's referring to himself. One day, Stephan called me. We had infrequent but lengthy conversations, sometimes in clusters. He told me I'd be hearing from some people from China. He'd given my contact information to Ms. Shin from CCTV. Shin and her crew were making a film to celebrate 80 years of the Long March, the epic event of the Chinese Revolution, about which Stephan's father, after retracing the entire route by van, truck, donkey, horse, had written a book. The CCTV crew was traveling around in a van. I was the person to interview about American journalists in China, Stephan told them. Ms. Shin did the interviewing. When I thought about it, if I had all sorts of things to tell her, China hands are a subject I knew about. My own father was one. And after a lot of complicated things, including calls to Beijing, electric short circuits in the house thanks to their powerful lights, I recall being strapped to a dining room chair and subjected to an inquisition on the Long March, on Mao Zedong, and on Hcus Salisbury. It was very specific to the glorification of the Chinese Revolution. It was also, in 2016, a very, very hot summer in Belmont, Massachusetts. After about 4 hours, the videographer made me walk over and over up the street in front of my house with a watering can. Stephan and I spent a number of phone calls discussing, along with, why did they go to Salisbury, Connecticut, where Harrison did not live, even though his adopted family, my Rand cousins, do live there. We also talked about why they strapped me to a chair. Stephan and I had decided to write a serious nonfiction fantasy about the Long March, how Mao forces American reporters to go on the Long March, and the role Ms. Shin and the others play in the story. Of course, the Chinese film crew and Ms. Shin ended up camped in Swarthmore for a day of non-stop interviewing, about which Stephan and I compared notes. Harrison was going to be a feature of the documentary. So was Stephan. The CCTV people decided this, and on the spot, they offered to fly Stephan and Jennifer out to China to film them on the Long March route. I told Stephan to demand business class seats for the long flight, but Stephan said this was not possible. In China, Jennifer and Stephan were taken to the Long March route on a long, very colorful drive through great swaths of Chinese landscape. In Hunan and Sichuan, and posed on the bridge over the Danube Gorge, such as Harrison and Charlotte, his wife, had once done. When Stephan came back, he said this would be great material for our dystopian anti-propaganda book, a movie about the forced Long March and how we could show American journalists teaching Chinese generals how to square dance. Not just punching some psilocybin interludes along the gorge. Then, for their 8-hour movie, CCTV flew Stephan and Jennifer back to China for 3 days to participate in the 80th anniversary celebration in Beijing. Stephan and Jennifer wanted to stay maybe longer than 3 days, perhaps a week, to see the army statues in Xi'an. The Chinese said no, just 3 days, strictly Beijing. At the ceremony, on the spur of the moment, they told Stephan to make a 3-minute speech, which Stephan had to improvise on the spot. After a performance of the Long March theme song, beautifully sung by the American popular singer Johnny Flute, who lives in China, this ceremony, held in various places in Beijing, including the Great Hall of the People, was an enormous event. The Long March was epic and heroic. Revolutionary soldiers made a trek of many months through terrible terrain under constant pressure of war, hunger, bitter cold, to reach safety in the Northwestern Territories from the bombers of the Chiang Kai-shek. What is evident from the video Jennifer showed me of Stephan's totally improvised talk is how wonderfully and clearly in his 3-minute speech, Stephan captures this legendary event and its meaning for his father, who insisted on being allowed to travel the Long March with his wife, General Chen, and Jack Service, among others, to describe it in detail in his account of the journey. Stephan, in a room full of hundreds of men and women, all dressed in gray, appears composed and elegant in his own light gray suit. Thoughtful. He does full justice and shows plain respect for the occasion, his host and his father whom he loved. Stephan knew how to keep a straight face. He looks cosmopolitan in that gray suit. How could they even imagine what was going on in his mind? His revolutionary, bright, illuminated, brilliant, creative mind. It would have made a superb book, a masterpiece.
My name is Eugene Corner, and Stephan was my uncle. My grandmother, Charlotte, married Harrison, Stephan's father, before I was born, and so I was blessed, as were my brothers, with having Stephan as our uncle in our extended family. Except to us, he was not Stephan. We called him Uncle Fluffy. I'm not a writer, as was he, but I'll do my best to explain the moment he got his name and what it has stood for. I have two full brothers. We grew up in the far northwest corner of Connecticut, about 3 hours from New York City. My brothers could not be here today, and so I'm speaking for them as well. When I was 8, my older brother 10, and my younger brother 4, our parents separated. Something in particular must have been happening at one point, because my older brother and I were sent to New York to spend a day with our Aunt Ellen and Stephan. As it turned out, my brother and I had the absolute best time. We were the center of attention, with love and fun just pouring out of them toward us. And it was not just what we four did together, although we did see a magic show, but how we were together, how they were with us, how they joked with us, had conversations with us, and played with us, how they cared for us in that somewhat vulnerable moment. At one point, we were walking down the city streets, and it was decided that Ellen and Stephan should have new names. And so it was, without any hesitation on anyone's part, that Stephan became Uncle Fluffy. And Ellen became Cousin Eleanor. Uncle Fluffy stuck, Cousin Eleanor did not. It was in their expression of wit, creativity, and kindness toward us that we immediately understood the very valuable life lesson that the collection of humor, kindness, and love could conquer most anything. And so what Uncle Fluffy became for us, the name and the human carrying that name, was just that. Sincerity, honesty, wit, togetherness, humor, and kindness. That day was about 44 years ago. Ellen and now Uncle Fluffy have passed. But what they gave will last forever. So thank you, Uncle Fluffy, for helping the children in your life find humor. Even amidst the sometimes difficulties in life, and even when just walking down a busy city street. As my then 10-year-old brother said to me, he made us feel happy and safe in a storm. Aww. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Thomas Hine. I sat next to Stephan at the Inquirer in 2 different newsrooms for about 14 years. That's a long time. I should have some great stories, some great, full telling details of the kind that Stephan would have if he were writing a story. Faced with my task today, I keep coming up blank. Stephan and I were thrown together when the Inquirer created a cultural department after the Bulletin closed in early 1982. I left the Inquirer at the beginning of 1996, and Stephan and I were next to each other for almost all that time in between. As we know, he kept working at the Inquirer for decades more, amassing thousands of stories, many of them seemingly routine, a body of work that revealed to Philadelphians not only the treasures in their midst, but also much that had been suppressed, forgotten, or even literally buried. The time we worked together was, in retrospect, a golden age of American journalism, and for the Inquirer in particular. What I remember, though, is that we complained just about every day about the Inquirer, our co-workers, about the city, about the state of the world. Stephan played, at least, a world-class pessimist. He seemed to delight in telling me bad news or making dire predictions. I've never seen him happier than he was the day that Wall Street crashed. And when it came roaring back the next day, he said to me, "Same thing happened in 29." He did his doomsaying with some surprisingly high spirits, often with a low, simmering chortle punctuated with the occasional guffaw. I think it was that dark laugh that led one of our colleagues to call us, she thought, behind our backs, Beavis and Butthead. Tom Wolfe once wrote that while news reporters competed with their counterparts in other publications, the feature writer's rival is sitting at the next desk. And actually, both Stephan and I probably consider ourselves primarily reporters, Stephan more so. But there's nevertheless something challenging and invigorating in seeing somebody who might just be better than you are. He was certainly more energetic and more dogged, reporting on his beat in the culture wars that surrounded it, while also pursuing long-term interests in prison conditions, and a number of other things. For a long time, we had to share a single computer terminal, but he was never not at it. Writing stories, taking notes on telephone interviews, transcribing interviews. It was so bad I started doing most of my writing at home. The last time we spoke, a couple of months ago, I reminded him of the way he used to drive me crazy about this. And he claimed not to know that we were supposed to be sharing. That was like him. He often seemed to be in a world of his own. You would see him deep in his thoughts, and as with a sleepwalker, it seemed very dangerous to interrupt. He was patient. He carried on as the Inquirer's ambitions shrank. When I would talk to him after I'd left the paper, he would report that his morale was low. But then his morale had always been low. He just ignored that and kept on doing very good work. He even, in 2014, helped convince me to go back as a part-time art critic, which I did for 7 years. About the newspaper, he was both an idealist and a realist. In a book review, he once wrote, "The Constitution guarantees a free press, but it doesn't guarantee that people will be interested." And alas, nobody seems to be interested anymore in what either of us did. But we Philadelphians know less today, or perhaps, I just wrote it, I'm talking about Stephan's great writing. I have a sentence that makes no sense at all. What I'm saying is, we don't have Stephan, and now we know less. I fear that to mourn Stephan is to mourn the cause of granular, locally rooted journalism that Stephan practiced. But while I've placed an emphasis first on hard work, as Stephan would, and it was done in the service of a moral vision and a precise, lively style. While preparing for this talk, I reread parts of Stephan's 2010 book, Mohammed's Ghosts, a work that I think really shows what he was all about. Very early, I was struck by what seems to just be a bit of description. I'm quoting now. Looming over all, just behind the hum and rattle of I-95, the Allied chemical complex sprawled, mainstay, lifeline, and sometimes explosive threat to the neighborhood. At times, the outlines of its intricate maze of pipes and tanks covering 45 acres near the Delaware River flickered in a tracery of bright white lights, another worldly outline of the toxic workaday world. One sentence. This single Dickensian sentence perfectly evokes a physical milieu along with its paradoxical impact on its neighbors, whom it employed to poison. A few paragraphs later, he writes a very short sentence. Fear is the clay of power and of reality itself. I can imagine him composing this grim sentence and smiling, even laughing, and then moving on. After all, he had a book to finish. In another of his reviews, he begins describing a central character, and he says, "He is the most ordinary of men, a journalist." Well, we know that Stephan was an extraordinary journalist and an extraordinary man.
Good afternoon. My name is Peter Dobrin. I'm an arts reporter and music critic at the Enquirer, and Stephan and I were colleagues for nearly 30 years. I had originally planned to speak about Stephan today in a kind of double byline piece with Becky Clark, who had been Stephan's editor for more than a decade. And though she's unable to be with us this afternoon, what follows is strongly shaped by our recent conversations about Stephan. More than once in the past few weeks, I found myself faced with a question about a story and seized for a split second when I thought that I should call Stephan to see what he thinks. I'm sure to this day there are readers who turn to the Enquirer half expecting we'll find something by Stephan. Maybe a profile of a newly appointed president of the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts with a string of revelations, none of which originated in a press release, or an analysis explaining what went wrong at the old Appleworth County Museum. These were the kinds of stories that set the cultural conversation in the city, that knitted together the arts community, and that were testimony to the kind of trust that develops between a reader and a writer when that reader covers a beat for a very long time. Stephan started out writing about murders, fires, bank robberies, salmonella outbreaks in Chester County, and violence in Graterford Prison. And in those early years, you could tell there was an arts writer struggling to get out. This is from Stephan. At the east end of Marshallton, along Strasburg Road, the land falls away to the south, rolling toward the Brandywine Creek. A dilapidated pink house peers out over this gentle expanse, out over a broad sloping field marked by a wooden red barn, 5 clustered evergreens, and a brilliant spray of forsythia. Inside this house, rarely emerging now, lives a torn family. It was a story about a murder, and this was Stephan's lead. Soon, Stephan was put to use in the Enquirer's art section. In the early 1980s, Stephan visited Betsy and Andrew Wyeth. Betsy had written a book about the Olsen family, Christina Olsen being the subject of one of the most famous paintings anywhere, Christinas World. Imagine picking up the paper on the morning of January 5th, 1983, and finding this gift of a passage in the middle of Stephan's 3,600-word piece. At 65, Andy Wyeth was a spry and animated host, friendly, gracious, and forthcoming. While he spoke, his pale hands and long fingers fluttered in bird-like animation against the dark sky of navy turtleneck and black jacket. They seemed to trace his words, sketching in details of conversation, filling in tone, rounding off sentences in the air. His eyes, triangular flecks of blue, shifted in color and intensity with the ebb and flow of expression. Bright during eddies of laughter, cloudy during pools of reflection. Betsy Wyeth, 60, wears a flowing denim dress and brass buttons angling like a sash across the front. Spoke in a mildly husky voice, often falling into dramatic whispers about the Olsens, their world, and the book. She offered coffee, cookies, and nuts from silver service to her visitors. As the winter light faded down and the brown field outside dissolved into darkness, she lit several candles on the table. The spare room in the old stone house flickered with yellow light from hearth and candle, and the modern world of engine and industry, notably absent from Wyeth's painting, seemed to vanish in reality as well, only to intrude occasionally with a harsh jangle of the telephone. "Leave it off the hook," Wyeth exclaimed, charming. In 1984, when Alice Neal died, Stephan wrote the obituary, Her estate continues to quote from it today. It begins with a long lyrical phrase that also somehow evokes Neil's frank and vivid style. Alice Neil, 84, a witty, strong-willed, irascible painter who labored in the spirit most of her life and finally became recognized as one of the country's finest artists, died Saturday at her home in New York. Steadfast in the pursuit of her own vision and amused by her ability to shock both the art world and the arbiters of American taste, Miss Neil lived a singular life devoted utterly to painting and to the laughing, suffering world around her. Stephan's coverage, of course, continued to evolve, and I think his most impassioned work came at 2 points when beloved pieces of art threatened to be removed by billionaire art collectors. Thomas Aiken's The Rose Clinic and Maxfield Parrish's Tiffany Glass Mosaic, The Dream Garden. It's pretty clear that if Stephan did not frame the public conversation around those 2 episodes the way he did, both works might have lived elsewhere. I don't think I ever heard anyone describe Stephan in what he practiced as watchdog journalism, but that's what it was. Stephan used his deep understanding of how arts institutions operated to hold them to account. I often overheard interviews where Stephan would let us host talk for 10 or 15 minutes at a stretch while he said little. I was startled when he lost patience with an interviewee hiding behind assembling and euphemisms. He had an incredible number of sources and an ability to recall details of an astonishing number of events. The NEA culture wars over public funding of the art in the 1990s, or stories about various characters who passed for the Inquirer over his 4 decades. Sometimes we would fall into a conversation about the Inquirer and its golden age. But what was great about Stephan is that he would also say that the good old days were not always so good, and certainly not good for everyone. One thing we continued to talk about after Stephan's retirement was the life of the arts in Philadelphia. I'd like to think these conversations were a pretty good deal for both of us. I'd get the benefit of talking to someone who would ask hard questions. He'd get caught up on topics that continue to occupy his thoughts. What was going on at the Village of Arts and Humanities in North Philadelphia, or most recently, what the hell happened at the University of the Arts. His fervor never waned. A few weeks before Stephan's death, I called him to talk about a fairly ambitious story I was interested in doing. It involved a large cast of characters and proposed to document a particular world, a cultural circle that existed for a century but was now disappearing. This is one of Stephan's favorite themes, some long-established aspect of culture that was shifting without anyone talking about it or even seeming to notice. The story would take months to record, and the more we talked, the more excited Stephan became. Sometimes when I proposed stories ideas to Stephan, he would say, "That's worth doing," or "I read that story." This time he said, "I want it on my desk by the end of the day, Thursday." He didn't mean it literally, of course, but it was an outburst of enthusiasm, quality not always apparent in his surface demeanor, that was central to who he was. The world was an endless supply of great stories to Stephan, and he seemed forever delighted to be quietly listening for them. Not that the process was always a pretty one. Stephan could become agitated or even balky when talking to an editor about a proposed story. Sometimes he would even say no. He had a recurring line that I can hear him saying right now: "That is a really dumb idea." Then he would go outside for a walk or a smoke. Quite often he would come back to his desk and start making calls. The next week, or sometimes even the next day, there would be 1,200 words in the paper on a topic that would bear no resemblance to how the story idea started out, but left no doubt that it was the version of the story that everyone else had missed, and the only one that really got to the truth. It was part performance art, this newsroom drama, and it was a masterclass. A masterclass in not immediately accepting what first appears to be the story, in the importance of critical thinking, in clarity and economy, and the power of the right words to bring about change. For those of us within his orbit, colleagues and readers alike, it was a privilege and a thrill.
These are some tough acts to follow. I'm Norman Hcus, and forgive me if I stay close to my roots. I just know that Stephan tended to take stock of every single word. During the time that I worked with him, a couple of decades at least, Stephan Salisbury made continuous impact in our city. Over at the Art Museum, I knew that one phone call from Stephan could dramatically change my day, my week, my month. I didn't know him as fluffy. Eugene Corner was the director when I arrived there. Among the first things I remember her saying to me was, "Norman, get to know Stephan Salisbury. He is a great reporter." As you know, as Peter alluded, he had done fine work writing about key cultural assets facing the risk of being sold and carted away from this historic city. Like the breathtaking Dream Garden over in the Hcus building. Go see that if you haven't, and thank him when you do. Because yeah, he did help to save that. Stephan understood that art can be civic as well as beautiful, central to the city's history and promise. The culture is local and priceless. I viewed my working relationship with him, mostly, I'd like to say, as one of kindred spirits who played for different teams. We could be collaborators, but we could also see things very differently. Exclamation point. He was a newspaper reporter, after all. But Stephan wrote with imagination. He could bring the past to life based on shards of colonial-era pottery. He could give a painting's conservation story the drama of open-heart surgery. He loved contemporary art. I always returned his phone calls. He always returned mine. And there was a rhythm to these. They typically began with Stephan talking wryly about the headlines our politicians were making. I think, Tom, you put this a little more colorfully. The fate of the precarious art community, the city itself, and then more tenderly, what was up with Molly, or Nadie, or Jennifer, and her art. During the pandemic, these talks took on even a more personal, often graver note, as family members got COVID. And this kind of discussion always preceded the business at hand. In this way, our relationship gained dimension. I'm a husband and a father too, and I could tell in these phone calls just how incredibly proud he was of his family, how precious it was. In my time at the museum, one very public story by him stands out. It was more accurately an epic. On the phone one day, Stephan struck this very strangely urgent tone and cut right to the chase. A deadline of embargoed news was fast approaching. He was short on detail, just needed to interview the director, and oh yes, he hated those embargoes. You could only guess what was at stake. I sped across the hall to brief the director and bumped into our head of collections. We looked at each other. What if it's the Gross Clinic? It had to be that. Oh my God. As it happened, Washington's National Gallery and the Crystal Bridges Museum, newly founded in Arkansas, had agreed to purchase, jointly from Jefferson University, the immense masterpiece by that very complicated artist of Philadelphia, Thomas Hcus. It had been the art scandal of the nation's centennial exhibition, and expressly because it was such a Philadelphia icon, the buyers noted that Philadelphia could actually keep the painting if our institutions could meet the price of $68 million, offer expiring in 45 days. Stephan's story caused an uproar, and when Ann told the Times, in response to a follow-up inquiry, that we were undertaking a public appeal, joining forces with the Pennsylvania Academy, where Hcus once taught, That reporter seemed to dismiss the effort as pandering. For his part, Stephan went after the story like a heat-homing missile, producing a constant stream of content every day. It would seem like a David and Goliath matchup, also complicated by the sticky prospect of deaccessioning. But the fever made the fundraising a cause célèbre. Philadelphia's philanthropic community, some initially apprehensive, began to mobilize. A completely unexpected $8 million gift also came in from New Jersey, inspired by the publicity. Donations arrived from 12 states, then 24, finally all 50. School children contributed their allowances. It was all copiously chronicled by Stephan in the Enquirer. The Gross Clinic had become a crucible of civic pride. We all know the outcome of this Camelot story. The painting would remain in Philadelphia in rotation between the museum and PAFO. This was the most spectacular example of art-inspired civic engagement in my time, certainly. And at City Hall, the press conference announced the triumph to countless congratulations. I'll never forget the poker face look on Stephan there. He just kept on taking notes to report the news. Success has 1,000 authors, and this one belonged to as many as there are stars in the sky. But there was also a smaller constellation of individuals that drove it, and that's where I see Stephan's star. We bonded on that story. He was a dedicated reporter, but more than that. Years later, I confess, and I privately began to look forward to the time when his work at the Enquirer and mine at the museum would no longer have to shape our exchanges, but instead, when those more ritual warm-up conversations we had would rightly become the main event to build friendship on. I admired his craft of writing. At his book signing for Brit and Jimmy Strike Out, he wrote in our signed copy, "To Norman and Sarah, great to see you. Enjoy, if that's the right word." My wife and I were touched to be invited to Jennifer's art opening to see her beautiful monotypes. Surprisingly, Stephan eventually even took an interest in my semi-secret efforts at painting, after I felt comfortable enough to share pictures. The last time I saw him, sitting under a tree with Jennifer in their garden earlier this summer, we freely shot the breeze, both unencumbered by past employment. He asked me to share photos from an art opening of my own, but time would run out before I could. Most important, what I did share were the words that Anne Darncourt had said so long ago, that I should get to know this great reporter. I am grateful for her advice, and for that precious moment with Stephan Salisbury. Stephan and I were of the same mind about the civic value of art and of museums at their best. Okay, we didn't always agree, but I admired the values he placed on his palette, the passion he embodied, the dedication to a vision of public service. Over at the Enquirer, that passion went to press time and again. Stephan Salisbury had the story. He was all over it. That's what I'll always want to remember.
My name is Michael Cord, and Stephan was my comrade. Correction, not was, but is. We in the African tradition believe that people don't die, they just move away. But they continue to communicate with us in ways that might surprise us. I'm the founder and attorney for a group called ATTAC, A-T-A-C, Avenging the Ancestors Coalition. And if you know anything about history in Philadelphia, you know about the President's House at 6th and Market. Well, a little-known group called ATTAC back in 2002 began to raise hell about that site at 6th and Market. We found out that, one, the Park Service was moving the Liberty Bell Center from 5th and Market to 6th and Market. No big deal. Two, we find out that the 6th and Market site was the site of America's first White House. It was known as the President's House, the Executive Mansion, the Robert Morris Mansion. Say, okay, interesting, but no real big deal. But the third thing we found is that at that site, George Washington enslaved 9 of the 316 black men, women, and children that he held at his Mount Vernon, Virginia plantation. And when I talk about this, I enjoy speaking to people who nod their heads because they know a little bit about it. And the reason they know a little bit about it is because of Stephan. Stephan put us on the map. He was the only journalist, black, white, Asian, Latino, whatever, who took this topic seriously and then allowed black activists to speak for themselves. By the way, he came to my law office and did a great story about me that got me about 1 million clients. So, but in all seriousness, it's really interesting because I refer to myself in paraphrasing the great James Baldwin, who said, to be black and conscious in America is to be in a constant state of rage. And what he meant by that is the more you know about America and its history, the more outrage you'll be. When I met Stephan, I began to call him the angriest white journalist. Because he was almost as angry as me. And we developed such a tight friendship. He knows about my love for hip hop. Obviously knows my name is Michael Ford, so he called me MC. I thought that was pretty witty. And I called him, he called himself Little Stevie Van Zandt. So we had this thing going, and I don't want to bore you with a bunch of stuff, so I'm going to speak for maybe 2 more minutes, but we would have these esoteric conversations and discussions where we pretty much, I'm also a journalist, we hated our editors. So we would vent to each other about how dumb they were. Going to read all of the, and this is really kind of emotional for me, so I'm not going to read all the text that we had back and forth, but I'll just spend a minute or so. And we pretty much would vent about the serial comma, or the Oxford comma. We would vent about whether or not punctuation goes inside or outside of a quotation mark. And we would tell our editors what the real story was. They wouldn't listen to us, but we knew we were right. So we were right. So I was going to go back and forth with all the bad things we said about our editors regarding the Oxford comma, but we don't have enough time for that. So let me just read to you just a couple things. And by the way, our text communications about grammar and punctuation in journalism went from June 6, I got all the texts, June 6, 2021 through 11/26/2022. But I'm not going to read those. Let me just, each time I would reach out to him in regard to the battles I had with my editors, he would always respond. Here's one from March 12, 2020 at 4:40 p.m. I asked him questions regarding the serial comma, Oxford comma, all that, and here's what I said to him. He gave me some great info, and my response to him was, "You the man, bro. Thanks for your quick response," which was much quicker than other folks. His response was, same date, March 12, 2020, "White guys can't jump, but they're quick to their emails." And to wrap this up, we began to talk about much more serious stuff. So the final 3 I'm going to share with you. One is from March 12, 2020. And he and I would talk about the issue of race and racism in America. This direct quote from him, March 12, 2020. "As a white man in this country, I fear for all of us, honestly. We are up Schitt's Creek, and we need a rainbow coalition in the streets to have even a fighting chance. The streets, maybe, possibly, will give us a shot." And then I responded to him, same date, "You are the cultural descendant of John Brown, and therefore an honorary member of ATTACK. Eventually he answers, the only white member of our group." But, and his response was, "Wow, you're kidding. Thank you." And I accept.
My name is Hcus. Stephan and I have always shared a deep interest in books, reading them and writing them. The first time we met, in fact, was at a National Books Critics Circle meeting in New York back in the 1980s, when discovery books would require, and I was freelancing. Over the years, we continued our conversation about literature. I was especially moved and appalled, shocked by his first book, Remembrances Ghosts. His first foray into novel fiction, the scarily prescient Grit and Jimmy Strike Out. Here's a book right here, I'm going to read from. I first read a manuscript I first read a novel in manuscript form in 2013. But it seemed to be set in a somewhat distant future when life is dominated, or life was dominated by personalized electronic feeds, when selfhood was defined by a brand, the president has hyper-monetized his media-driven presidency. This is 2013. By the time the novel was published in 2018, it seemed like a spot-on satire of the current Trump reality. The language in it is jazzy and futuristic, and the whole scene, the whole setting is kind of post-apocalyptic. I'm going to read a little bit from it. The main characters are Grit and Jimmy, who are what we would now call influencers. And this is 2013 years writing this. They are the one from the surveillance state, something Stephan was especially concerned about. I'm just going to read a little bit from the book to give you a flavor of his language, of his fictional language. We've heard from his journalistic reporting. This is his jazzy, futuristic, looking ahead language. And Grit and Jimmy have just arrived in a landscape. This afternoon, here at the Cultural Society, might seem especially eerily familiar. This must be it, I say, looking up at the blackish face, the desiccated ziggurat, the Orpheum. Not much else around here. A few broken buildings, emptiness, the usual debris. We are standing in an open square, surrounded by neat piles of collapse, a teetering stony column at the center, fenced off lots here and there on the perimeter. It seems like we've spent hours slowly walking, not talking much, just kind of feeling our way along this old, unknown world. My pad has been buzzing constantly since the Hcus, really. I'm not sure what that was about. The Hcus part of the novel. It's early in the novel. But I haven't opened up. Jimmy warns that the buzzing is a tracking maneuver, though I don't understand that. The darn thing pings all the time anyway. It broadcasts me into the air around the world every 0.02 seconds, no matter what. And the satellites, home right in through wave frequencies and pingulation. Great word. Sats are picking up a lot of the work street feeds used to do, Jimmy says. So many of these feeds are down, it's too much hassle to bring them back and coordinate the info, he says. Sats do the job, and more. I don't get it, I said to Jimmy. What's the point of trying to make contact? Who's calling anyways? Jimmy says, you mean the buzzing? They want to see you. They want to smell you. And everything around you. How do you figure that? I ask. Who? It's not just knowing where you are, but where you're going, and what you're planning, he replies. That's the way I figure it. You can open up and find out. We're standing in the Orpheum in all its dark squatness. Everything around here seems so forgotten. The fringe of the Ville, so outside the hood. Things were spread out, more openly broken than our close little neighborhood of straggling piles. The hood seems far away now. We haven't gone all that far, I don't think. Hard to say with this walking. Jimmy looks around. He looks way up toward the blank rooftop house and toward the teetering central column. He spins on his head. Spins on his heel. Spins on his heel. Nothing. I mean, this is what I think they want to do, he says. First off, they want to talk you back to Zonoraki in the hood, get you off the streets. Okay, you're contacted. You flip open your phone. They say exactly where you are, the two-way. They process your demeanor, heartbeats, breath, blood pressure, biometrics. Get behind your eyes. They see into you. Oh, they know what you see and what you do with what you see, all right? And then they entice, he says. They take it all in and sweeten it and talk you back to base. Come to us, Brit. We can show you the micros. We can optimize your sight. We can deck you out. We can fill you with whatever your little heart desires. Green shorts? We got them. Bike parts? Sure. Boys? Not a problem. You will overflow. Come back, little Brit. Yeah, thank you.
So first I want to just thank everybody who shared these memories so far. It's been very moving. I'm Nathaniel, Stephan's son, and I'm just going to share a short poem by William Blake called A Dream. Once a dream did weave a shade over my angel garden bed, that and it lost its way where on grass we thought I lay. Troubled, wildered, and forlorn, dark benighted, travel worn. Over many a tangled spray, all heart broke, I heard her say, "Oh, my children, do they cry? Do they hear their father sigh? Now they look abroad to see, now return and weep for me." Pitying, I dropped a tear, but I saw a glowworm near, who replied, "What wailing wight calls the watchman of the night? I am set to light the ground, while the beetle goes his round. Follow now the beetle's hum, little wanderer, hide thee home." Thank you. Now, please stay a little while and get some drinks and share with each other and us and more memories of my dad. And thank you again so much for coming. Really appreciate it.
I want to also thank everybody for coming. Please do get coffee and snacks and just talk and tell stories and memories.